And wherever you find yourself, first I just want to say I'm glad that you're here. I think when life is not going the way we want it to, this is sometimes a hard place to be. When life isn't maybe going according to the plan or the way that we think it should go, it can be hard to show up here. But second, I'm sure that you can agree that life in general is just pretty messy. No matter what sort of plan we have for our days or for our life, it doesn't always work out that way. I know for us in our house, it's been especially messy over the last couple weeks or month, it feels like. Lexi's been back at school, starting work again, so getting used to new schedule, kids starting daycare, figuring that all out, also fighting sickness all the time, just with two littles in the house. And then we moved about a month ago, and that's just been crazy as well, getting used to that and still unpacking boxes when if you would have asked me 3 months ago if we were going to move, I would have said absolutely not. No way. We're not moving. We just moved a year ago. We're not moving again. But no, we jumped right back into it. And so it's been kind of crazy. And I say all that, and I know some of you are out there saying, like, that's pretty lightweight. Like, you think that's busy? Like, let me tell you what's been going on in my life. But for us, it's felt like a lot. And in these busy seasons, it often feels like I'm reacting to life rather than living out some sort of plan that God has for me, right? It kind of just feels like I'm just trying to make it through rather than, following some sort of thing that God's leading me on. And I mean, how am I supposed to be discerning God's will for my life if I can't even remember to put enough diapers in the diaper bag, right? It's a struggle sometimes. And sometimes I find myself wondering, how exactly is God working in my life? How is he moving through what seems like pretty normal circumstances? And I imagine that you've wondered this too. It's not like it's super obvious all the time how God's showing up. There's not usually a booming voice coming down from heaven telling us what to do. There's rarely a hand writing on the wall saying, hey, this is what you should do next. It doesn't happen that way. 99% of the time, life just kind of feels like normal life. It's mundane. It's messy. Most of the time, it's boring. And it's hard to really imagine, how is God... Is this what God's plan is? Is this what he's doing? Because it kind of just feels normal. It's especially hard when things don't seem to be going our way, though, right? When money is really tight, when we get a bad diagnosis, when we lose a friend or a job, when our circumstances seem hopeless. How exactly is God working in our lives? Luckily for us, we're not the first people to ask this question that follow God. In fact, I bet it's a question that the Jews in exile asked a lot. I bet it's a question that came up often. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I'm saying the Jews in exile, when you're reading through the Old Testament, you see God. I'm getting used to using this, so if I look back on that, that's why. Oh, wait. Man, there we go. Got it. You see God. In the Old Testament, God chose the Israelites at the beginning. And this is their history, really briefly. God chose the Israelites. And then we read stories of how he led them to the promised land. He led them to be his people. He taught them what that's going to look like, how they can follow him. And then they ask for a king, and so he establishes a kingdom, and they're given a king. And that does not work out the way that they wanted it to. Basically, king after king after king, it's a mess, and they're not following God, and they're leading the nation astray. And so God gives them over to enemy kingdoms to be exiled. And eventually just says that's enough, and he allows them to go into exile. And if you're living in this history, if you were an Israelite and you found yourself in exile, I feel like it'd be really easy to start thinking, wow, God's kind of given up on us, right? Like, we messed it up. God doesn't have a plan for us anymore. It was probably incredibly hard to see if God was working in their lives in any way, right? If there was a plan for Israel, maybe they messed him up. And I think one of my favorite stories from this era of history that we read in the Bible is the story of Esther. And the structure of Esther is laid out to highlight certain themes. One of the most unique things that the book of Esther has for it is that it is the only book in the Bible that never mentions God by name. Never. You read through the whole thing, God doesn't show up, and he doesn't get mentioned in any way. And this is actually an intentional choice by the author. It's an invitation to look for God's activity through the story. They do it so that you think, this is weird. Why is this not talking about God? But you are looking for it as you're reading through the story. You're looking for God to show up in some way. The author of Esther also uses this common literary technique you find throughout the whole Bible. This is the Bible nerd part of it, but it's called narrative chiasm. That's a big word you can use, but narrative chiasm, and the way that works is the way that they write the story. The beginning of the story kind of mirrors the end of the story, and so on and so forth, all the way until the middle. And the reason why they do this is because they're trying to highlight the middle. It's this poetic device that really emphasizes some point in the story where everything matches all the way down to the one point that's unique. And Esther, the entire story is built this way. The whole story is written in this way that it really highlights the middle of the text. And when you look at the story as a whole, you see all this symmetry, and it really points out this one chapter. And you find that in chapter 6 of Esther. And that's what I kind of want to look at today as we go into this story and really look on what the author himself was trying to highlight when he wrote this story. What was the point that he really wanted to make? There are 4 main players in this story. There's Esther, who's the queen, and she was married to King Ahasuerus, or we might know him as King Xerxes, but that's like the Hebrew translation of Xerxes, Ahasuerus. Well, I think Xerxes is the Greek translation, but again, I'm getting into nerdy stuff. But yeah, that's the king. And then Mordecai is Esther's uncle, and then there's Haman, who's the king's right-hand man, and he's the villain of the story. And these are the 4 main characters. They're really what the whole story kind of centers on. And I kind of want to get you up to speed before we jump into chapter 6 of what goes on in this story and what's going on as we lead up to this. So Esther and Mordecai are Jewish, and they're living in Persia and as exiles. And so it says that Esther is beautiful, and so the king chooses to make her his queen. Haman, the villain, hates Mordecai. They both work for the king, but Haman's a little bit higher up than Mordecai is, and Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. So Haman tricks the king into making a law that will allow him to kill the Jews. Mordecai reaches out to Esther to use her position and influence to have the law changed, overturned. But it's not as simple as Esther just going and asking the king and having him change this. In fact, she's so nervous about going to do this, about going into his presence unasked, because she thinks that she'd be killed if she goes and does this. And it must happen enough that she's worried about it, right? She must have seen this happen, that people are going in there unwelcomed, and so the king just has them killed. They're going in there unsummoned by the king, and the king has them killed because she's really worried about it. Like, she's talking about this like, hey, there's a really good chance that if I go and try to talk to the king about this, I'm going to get killed for this thing. But Mordecai, probably in the most famous verse from Esther, Mordecai says, if you do nothing, we'll all be killed anyway. And who knows, maybe you've been put in this position for such a time as this. So Esther agrees to go talk to the king, and very dramatically, she says, if I perish, I perish. And she goes off to make her plan on how she's going to make this happen. And so the way that she does this, she decides that she approaches the king, and it goes really well, and she invites him and Haman to a banquet. Like, hey, I'm going to butter him up a little bit, take him to a banquet, make him see that, like, maybe this is a good thing to listen to my wife. And so she brings him to a banquet, and the banquet is such a good time that Esther decides, hey, let's have another banquet, and maybe at that banquet, I'll bring it up. Maybe at that banquet, I'll ask him to overturn this law. But Haman leaves the banquet, the first banquet, feeling really great because, one, he, all by himself, has been able to go to a banquet, just the king and queen. That made him feel pretty important. And now he's been invited to a second banquet the following day. So he's like, man, I'm awesome. Everything's working out for me. I'm really great. And as he's leaving the king's gate, he's walking out, he's in a great mood, feeling good about himself, and there's Mordecai again. And he asks Mordecai to bow down to him, and Mordecai again refuses. And that ruins Haman's mood. So he goes home and he decides to have a gallows built for Haman. Says, you know what, I'm sick of this guy. I'm obviously very important in the eyes of the king and queen. I can get this done. So he has a gallows built for Haman. And he's like, in the morning, I'll go ask the king if we can just get rid of this guy, if we can kill him, and that'll be it. And so he goes to sleep. Everyone goes to sleep, and that leads us into chapter 6. And remember, this is the center of the whole book, and it's right here where everything changes for Esther and Mordecai. So if you will, read with me. All right, that night, sleep escaped the king. So he ordered the book recording daily events to be brought and read to the king. First off, I think it's pretty cool that the king is like, I can't sleep. Someone come talk to me about my life. Like, tell me, like, what's been great going on in my life. Like, I don't know. You know, I can't imagine doing that. I feel like that would put me to sleep. But they found the written report of how Mordecai had informed on Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the entrance when they planned to assassinate King Ahasuerus. So Mordecai, he tipped off that there were going to be these assassins that were going to kill the king, and he stopped it. So pretty big deal. There we go. The king inquired, what honor and special recognition have been given to Mordecai for this act? The king's personal attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. So the king asked, who is in the court? Now Haman was just entering the outer court of the palace to ask the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared for him. The king's attendants answered him, Haman is there, standing in the court. Have him enter, the king ordered. And Haman entered, and the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king wants to honor? So Haman thinks to himself, hey, it's probably talking about me. I'm the person that he likes a lot. I'm this important guy. So who is it the king would want to honor more than me? So Haman told the king, for the man the king wants to honor, have them bring a royal garment that the king himself has worn, and a horse the king himself has ridden, which has a royal crown on its head. Put the garment and horse under the charge of one of the king's most noble officials. Have them clothe the man the king wants to honor, parade him on the horse through the city square, and call out before him, this is what is done for the man the king wants to honor. So the king told Haman, hurry and do just as you propose to take a garment and a horse for Mordecai, the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not leave out anything you have suggested. So Haman took the garment and the horse, and he clothed Mordecai and paraded him through the city square, calling out before him, this is what is done for the man the king wants to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried off for home, mournful and with his head covered. Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai is Jewish and you have begun to fall before him, you won't overcome him, because your downfall is certain. While they were still speaking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and rushed Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared. All right, so things really turned around for Mordecai and Esther here. In this story, faithfulness to God is costing the Jews everything. The Jews are living in a foreign kingdom, and faithfulness to Jewish law always sets them apart. They can't eat with certain people, they can't follow certain social norms, and they definitely cannot bow down to anyone but God. And there were some Jews who decided this wasn't worth it. Our lives would be a lot easier if we just adapted to Persian life. And I'm sure Mordecai was really considering it, right? Like, things were not super going well for him. Like, his life was pretty good. He was probably considering if faithfulness to God was worth it. I mean, he was working for the king, which is good, but even so, his faithfulness to God was going to get him and all of his people killed. Maybe if he had just bowed down to Haman, things would be easier. They wouldn't be in this mess, right? And when this chapter begins, things are looking pretty grim for Mordecai. I mean, a gallows has been built with his name on it. Like, hey, this is for Mordecai. And Haman is on his way to ask the king if he can kill him. But all of a sudden, things change for the better. The king can't sleep. He just so happens to hear the story of Mordecai protecting his life as Haman is on his way to execute him. And instead of getting killed, Mordecai gets honored. How the turntables, right? Everything shifts. Everything changes for Mordecai and Esther. And this is actually the moment whenever Haman has to honor Mordecai is the exact center of the book. The moment that shifts is the exact center. But why does God wait, right? Like, sure, it makes a good story, but I'm sure that, Mordecai probably would have preferred if God had just, avoided it ahead of time, right? He probably would have liked it if God had stopped it all up front. And even so, the way God stopped it, the way that he intervenes is through kind of just everyday, normal occurrences. It's not like a bolt of lightning. He doesn't kill the king or Haman in any sort of way. And if Mordecai didn't think to attribute this to God, and he just attributed it to coincidence, I mean, I wouldn't be shocked. How often do we do that, right? If he just said, "Hey, that was great that worked out. Kind of crazy. That was a close call." I bet we all do that to some degree. See, God isn't mentioned in Esther, but it teaches us so much about who he is and how we can expect him to work in our world. It's a good reminder about how we should approach reading our Bibles. Did you know that the face recognition technology in our phones, that it gets better every time that you use it? Every time you open your phone, it pings a different part of your face and learns a little bit more about you so that if you ever get a haircut or break your nose or a face tattoo, it will still work. Like, that's why it does that. It's supposed to just know your face better and better every time you do it. I know I've scared some of you there, just telling you that. You're like, I'm never going to use the face recognition ever again. I'm done with it. But it's able to recognize you. And I think that's kind of how we should approach reading our Bibles. Every time we read Scripture, we are kind of pinging the face of God. We're getting a clearer picture of who he is and how he works so we can recognize him when he shows up in our lives and in the lives of the people around us. You see, in this chapter alone, we see a God who loves his enemies, who is righteous and just and redemptive. And it's our knowledge of God that allows us to have faith in him, right? If we knew him to be unreliable, if we knew him to be hateful and unjust, I mean, why would we have a faith in a God like that? But because we know who he is and his character, he's someone we can put our faith in. Mordecai's faith is based on the knowledge of God's character. It's not based on what he's going to get from God, but the obedience. He knows that obedience to God will always give him the best outcome. The Bible teaches us that God's ways are different from our ways. And even when we struggle to see how he's working in our lives, faith means believing that he is. Even when we struggle to see how he could be working in any of this, faith is saying God has a plan. God's working through it. God's doing something. And in this story, I think we see two huge ways that God would work differently than we would. God's ways are different than our ways. One of those ways is God's timing is different than ours. Mordecai and Esther probably would have preferred quicker action, but God moved at the right time. And in fact, it kind of seems like he set up the perfect domino of events and tipped them at just the right moment to save the Israelites. They would have probably preferred it before. And there are probably times in our lives where we would wish God would move in a way maybe quicker or in a different way than he does. But having faith in God is trusting that his timing is different and probably better than the way that we would do it. We also see that God's methods are different than our methods. God doesn't save his people by demolishing Persia. I think if I was God and I was looking at this situation, I would have a much more black and white view of the thing, like, oh, I need to save these people, so I just need to get rid of the people that are hurting them, or I need to, save them from exile, or whatever it is. But God doesn't do it by some huge action, but by subtly working through everyday events. He even shows that he works through and cares for the Persians on some level, right? Even though the Jews would have considered the Persians their enemies, God's still working through and with them. And this, I think, is one of the biggest lessons that we get from Esther, is that God works in the mess and moral ambiguity of human history to accomplish his purposes. He works within what's going on and the people that are involved to accomplish his purposes. He doesn't always send a bolt of lightning. He doesn't always, show up in a huge way. A lot of times, it's in small ways that we might miss. And this may not make sense to us. If this bothers you a little bit, that he works with people that maybe we wouldn't want to work with, that he works through people that we would say are not worthy of being used by God, that's just another example of how God would do things differently than we would. You see, in this story, when we look at that, it makes us realize that if we have an issue with that then God really couldn't work with any of us. If he's not willing to work in the mess, if he's not willing to work in just the everyday sort of parts of our lives, then he wouldn't be able to work with any of us. Maybe for us, what does this mean? Maybe the next time you're struggling to see how God is working in your life, ask yourself, how should you expect God to work in your life? Ask yourself how you've seen and known God to be working in your life and throughout history. Remind yourself how God works so you know where to look. Maybe your first step is just learning who God is and how God works a little bit more. Maybe that means you need to read your Bible to look for God's activity. Ask yourself what each story reveals about him to you. And even better, I think, putting yourself in a community with other people, in a small group of people who are asking those same questions and sharing with them. We all have a unique view into the activity of God, especially in our lives, but also in the lives that we're connected to as well. And we would all benefit from hearing from each other. That's why having a small group is so important. It allows us to not only understand each other, but it allows us to understand God so much better too, because we get the perspective of our peers. Building up, maybe you would benefit actually from leading those conversations in a children's ministry or in a youth ministry setting, getting their perspective, which is probably different, and one that Jesus really valued was the perspective of children and how they view God. You'd be surprised how being involved in the lives of younger people can really help you grow in your faith and how you view your relationship with God. Building up young people and listening to them and learning from them. What I think this story teaches all of us, believer or not, is that most of the time, we won't recognize God's activity. We'll probably miss it. We're not going to catch everything that God's doing in our lives or in the lives of those around us. There will be seasons in our life when it feels like God has taken a step back from our lives, and we won't know what he's doing or how he's working. And when it feels like God's taken a step back, he's probably asking us to take a step out in faith. You see, when all hope seemed lost for Esther, she said, "If I perish, I perish." She didn't know what God was doing. She didn't know if God was working in it at all, but she chose to have faith and put her life on the line. When God seemed absent, they put their lives fully in his hands, not their own. And I think the natural response to God's absence is to pull away from him. But what if he's actually calling us to follow him? Maybe when it feels like he's stepping away, he's leading us to take a step of faith. What if his absence means we've stayed in the same place too long, that we've gotten comfortable, that we need to take some steps forward? See, Esther could have stayed put in the royal court, and maybe Mordecai would have gotten killed. Maybe the people that she would have known that were Jewish would have gotten killed, and she probably would have been fine for most of the time. But eventually, it would have caught up to her, and she would probably be killed as well. It would not save her in the end, even if she stayed in the same place. So how do you need to take a step out in faith? Maybe that means joining a small group or committing to becoming a ministry volunteer or making a decision to commit your life to Christ. Maybe it means jumping headfirst into women's or men's ministry. Maybe it means committing to read the Bible or just to attend church regularly. Like, I'm going to be here every Sunday. Maybe it has nothing to do with the programs that are here at Mount Pleasant. Maybe you need to start ministering to the homeless or showing up and volunteering at nursing homes or going on a mission trip or something else entirely. Maybe you just need to take a step that puts you out of your comfort zone and makes you put your hands or your life in God's hands a little bit more. Maybe the reason you're struggling to see God is because you need to take a step out in faith. And imagine what would happen to our church if we all committed that in moments of uncertainty, we stepped out in faith rather than stepping back. We chose to trust God rather than, taking a step back from our faith. If we became a church that was constantly seeking to move towards God and what He's doing in the world, what would happen if you chose to take a step out in faith? If you chose to trust that He was working, maybe even before you saw it, maybe even before you totally believed it, you trusted that He was working. And who knows, maybe you're the one He needs to work through in the situation that's going on in your life, in the relationships that you're connected to, in the people and places that you're in. Maybe God has put you in that place or that position for such a time as this. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you this morning. Thank you for just the promise that you are working in our lives, God. That when we commit to you, that you have the best intentions for us, God. The best outcomes for our life come when we're obedient to you. And I pray that we can just see that, God, that we can trust you. And maybe if we don't even see where you're leading us, God, that we can trust you and that you're going to have us when we take those steps. I pray that you can hold us, that you can give us the courage and the boldness to do that, God. And in Jesus' name, amen.